Hi and welcome to my studio. It's Lois from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art here, and today I'm going to be using three colours to paint this atmospheric sunset scene. There's a fisherman standing on the bank with a kind of bit of a harbour wall and some distant trees. I really like this scene. It was inspired by a photograph that I found on Pixabay, and I've completely simplified the photograph and made my own version of it, changing things up quite a bit from the photograph. Here is the photograph from Pixabay that I used. You can see there's a really big bridge across the horizon line. Now that bridge, while it's very attractive, I think it would be really hard to get it to look effective, and I think it would overpower the painting, so I decided to remove the bridge. Everything else is sort of pretty much just about as it is, but a simplified version. I like that the foreground with the figure and the headland and the fishing rods is all in silhouette and in shadow, and then the sunset is glowing across the water with all these sort of distant details, quite pale. So first things first, I'm going to sketch it out very loosely, just putting in the main elements, making sure that everything's in the right place and in proportion before I start. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board. My board's at an angle of about 20 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. I'm going to start off painting wet in wet. So I'm using my large wash brush, which is a 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite Mottler brush, to wet the page all over. Once my paper's wet, then I shall start to introduce two of my three colours, which is raw sienna and burnt sienna. And begin to get that graduated wash in for the sky. So I want it to be fairly bright across the top of the sky, getting lighter and then becoming a little bit brighter again across the water. I can add more burnt sienna to the raw sienna for that intensity, and I'm keeping my brush strokes horizontal to make sure the water stays nice and flat. While it's still wet, I'm using a really rich mix of my third colour, which is indigo, and I'm going to get in my island. Now, indigo does dry back quite a lot lighter, so while this looks really dark, it will dry back to pretty much a mid-value of indigo, although, of course, indigo is quite a dark colour. But I'm making sure that I get my shapes about right, where the paint will still softly diffuse as I'm still painting wet in wet, and I want to kind of run out the brush stroke as it gets close to the water so that I can have the water's edge there established very softly before I bring in the detail. And now again, using this same sort of dryish mix of paint, I'm putting in my distant trees, the harbour wall. Well, those are the mid-ground trees and the harbour wall, and then I'll put the distant trees across the horizon line. So that's the first wet in wet layer finished. I now need to leave my painting to dry completely and not fiddle with it anymore. So here's the dry painting. It's dried back nicely. I've got those lovely soft but quite rich washes, and now what I want to do is paint with wet paint onto the dry painting, so using the wet on dry technique, and just firm up a little bit of the detail. So I just want to use really pale grey paint from the indigo to put in a few suggestions of detail on that harbour wall and behind it to show some sort of industrial activity going on. And then I'll put some darker value into the tree, a bit of reflection, and then I can continue working on the actual foreground headland itself. So back to my mottled brush and using really rich indigo this time, almost tube consistency with just a dab of water so it flows. And I'm putting in the headland in the foreground, and I'm working around some of the wet in wet indigo that I put in first, leaving patches of that showing through. This will give me variety of texture. It will also show areas where the light is just hitting a little bit more of parts of the headland, and it will suggest a few rocks and the texture of the ground. I'm feathering out the marks again as I approach the edge of the water, and just using the tips of the brush and sort of horizontal marks, and then I'll change to the 3/4 inch flat brush and just soften that reflection below that midground tree, and then use the tips of this brush to feather in some of the darker indigo marks across the waterline in the foreground. And now more indigo and my fine number 2 rigger brush, and trying to be confident so I get a nice straight line, putting in my fishing rods, tapering off the stroke at the end of the fishing rod so it seems to get a little bit shorter, and that's all I need is those simple lines. I'm not going to go back in, keeping it nice and fresh. And now just whatever it is that the fisherman has used to prop his rods up with, just going over the pencil marks that I made earlier. Just making that sort of look like maybe a box of fishing tackle, that sort of thing. Just the equipment, just silhouetted on the shoreline. And now for the figure. I'm using a small calligraphy brush. It's got a fine point but holds plenty of paint, and I find it useful. But any small brush with a good point is useful for figures, and I'm just literally going over my pencil marks, and this is one of the reasons I put him in quite dark so that he would stand out beneath the washes. I'm not trying to paint a person. All I'm trying to do is paint the overall shape that I can see. So I'm not focusing on arms or legs, because then I'd end up with something that looked a bit out of place, maybe too detailed. It's literally just the shape, the joined up shape. So that's the body and the legs just about done. When I'm painting these silhouetted figures, I usually put the body in first and then add the head at the end, so I can make sure that I keep everything in proportion, because I think it's a big beginner mistake to make the heads too large, and then the figures tend to have a sort of cartoon-like proportions. So always sort of put the head in a lot smaller than you think, and often you'll find that that smaller head actually works perfectly. I think this figure is just a little bit thin, but I'm not going to mess around with it, because once you've got a loose figure in, the more you fiddle, the worse it actually gets. So I'm quite happy with that. And now a quick straight stroke for his fishing rod. And yeah, I'm happy with the figure. So a few little finishing touches here and there, maybe some slightly darker horizontal marks below that tree there for the reflection, and then I just need to reflect the pole that's standing up from the harbour arm, but using very pale paint so it doesn't detract too much. Again, it's another thing that helps us focus on the figure as the main point of interest, because that's where the most detail is and the most contrast. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just put in a little bit of quite rich burnt sienna, using the tips of the flat brush and horizontal brush strokes, just to put a few highlights, brighter highlights in the foreground in the reflections. And then run through that again with the flat brush and a little bit of indigo just to blend that in. And I'm going to call that finished. I'm going to remove the tape, and I always like this part because removing the tape helps you to see the painting in a more sort of finished way, and you can see those nice clean edges. The border sort of almost looks like a mount or a mat or a frame. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this painting come together. It's quite a simple atmospheric painting. Some of the effects might take a bit of practice, but that's half the fun. So don't worry if it takes you a few goes to get something like this right. Remember, the first thing to do is to get that nice, soft, graduated wash using the horizontal brush strokes, and get a little bit of the dark in wet, and then bring the detail together wet on dry to bring the painting together. and just 3 colours: burnt sienna, raw sienna and indigo. Well, I hope that was helpful. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to everyone that supports the channel on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. Thank you so much. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.